Hi everyone, welcome for this session about Apex for beginners, and thank you for being so many on this meeting. And let's start. And in this session, we will talk a little bit about what is Apex and how it can help you building more compelling applications and, of course, user interfaces. A little bit about myself. I am from Italy, Italian, and coming here working for Salesforce. I've been in Salesforce for almost 4 years. I work for the platform services, so I typically use my knowledge for customers when they have to talk about security, about new applications, about integrations. So what we're going to see today is a little bit about the fundamentals, some basic ideas at the base of Apex and programming with Salesforce. Then we will see it in action, what it can do in a short demo, and then we will see how Salesforce needs testing, needs the developers to write also tests for the code that's written in order to deploy the code in production, because we want to be safe about the good working of the code, but also when it comes to all the updates and feature versions of Salesforce, the tests are run by our technicians in order to check that your code is still functioning and working correctly with all the updates that Salesforce delivers periodically. So in the course of this presentation, maybe you will see something new, something that is not yet available. I will warn you about these things. Of course, be careful and formulate your purchasing decision based on what is available on the product and on our online documentation. So as I said, let's have a look at the fundamentals. So today, most of us are using Salesforce as admins or, of course, users, and we are always challenged. The IT departments are challenged by creating new compelling applications, and this entails using many of the ingredients of the features that Salesforce provides. So we're talking about, and we'll see yesterday in the keynote, the artificial intelligence. We've seen the analytics. We've seen many things that are, surfaced, and new features that Salesforce constantly provides in its offering, its platform, the customer success platform. But more than that, we have identity management. More than that, we have also ways to deal about user experience. So these are the ingredients that we can use, we can leverage to create compelling applications and good working applications. Sometimes it's not just enough to use the clicks and to use the development, the setup environment in order to create compelling and working applications for large data volumes. In this case, Apex helps us, because Apex is the language that Salesforce has invented, let's say, taking much of the syntax and the details from Java in order to create scalable applications, large data volume applications that run within the servers of Salesforce. So one of the main points about Apex, about the Salesforce platform when it comes to creating applications, when it comes to creating compelling applications, is about the fact that with traditional platforms and developer tools, you still have to focus about the infrastructure. You need to provision the service, you need to buy them, you need to install them. Of course, you need to look after them, and you have less time left to focusing on your apps, on your real processes, what you want to really deliver to your customers. With Salesforce, it is the other way around. So less time spent on maintaining the infrastructure and much more time in creating applications and business logic. Salesforce actually gives you the option to choose between two alternatives. The first one, which actually is used to cover 80% of the needs of someone who wants to create and customize and personalize the user interface and the inner workings of Salesforce, is about click. So dragging, dropping, using the setup menu to create processes. You will see them in the developer forest sites here at the Dreamforce. There are plenty of tools in order to make it easy by just using clicks, even for admins, to create your applications. But still, when you want to achieve advanced functionalities, when you want to achieve advanced application behavior, you need to use code. And Apex is just this. So Apex is actually a set of techniques and coding environments that allow you to create controllers, to create triggers, to create the logic that stands behind your application. What is a controller? A controller is actually the mind of an application. It can be integrated with user experience, with the user experience, but also with the artificial intelligence. And the controller is the mind of your application, and it is typically written in Apex when you want to achieve very advanced behaviors in your application. And actually, the controller written in Apex is the one that takes and extracts the data from the data model, from the Salesforce database, and puts it, formats it, in order to be viewable, to be shown on the user interface. Maybe you've heard about Lightning components, and maybe many of you have written or used Visualforce pages. Those are the techniques and the tools that are used to show the information. But the controller is the one that really checks that the information are entered correctly and formats them for the user interface. So now we're going to see it in action. And what we will see is, particularly today, a trigger. A trigger is a piece of Apex code that gets run, that gets executed whenever a change, a new record gets inserted, we modify some information about the customer, or we delete some information about a customer or product, or every time we modify the data that is entered and it is within the Salesforce database, a trigger may come into action. If we enable it, if we write code with a trigger, it is much like a stored procedure. It gets instantiated and it starts working for us. So it executes, it's a little program, we will see it, and it tries to be as scalable as possible. So by default, it tries to find 200 people clicking on the same application, on the same operation, in order to be, much more efficient. So it is able to execute on up to 200 records per single execution. So it is able to scale, and also it is possible to write multiple triggers, typically one trigger per single object, but it is able to provide its services, and the code we write will be executed on many records at once. So think about the single click you make might be also the case that other customers around the world are clicking, or in your company are clicking on that same interface. So the trigger will take all this data and process them at once. Maybe you heard about governor limits. Governor limits are some sort of limitation that is put by Salesforce on your code, because as you might know, Salesforce is a multi-tenant infrastructure, so many customers are using the same servers, the same machines at once. So Apex is also able to put some guards, to put some limits, in order for your processes, in order for your Apex code not to take too much of the server's computational power, so that it could be slow down other users, or it might slow down other customers. So automatically Apex enforces some limits and some checks so that your application is always running smoothly by means of governor limits. So let us see it a little bit in practice. I have a small demo here. And this demo, I hope it is visible. We have, for example, a set of merchandise, so some products that we have put in, for sale. For example, this one is a record within Salesforce, and in the new Lightning experience, we can see all the details about this product. Sometimes it comes from, for a company, the time to retire, to withdraw a product from the market. But in this case, we want to do something more. If I withdraw a product from the market, from the user interface, it might be just sufficient to change its state from active to withdrawn. But so when I save, the new status will be withdrawn, and I have just modified the record. But sometimes, if this product is still available or is still inserted and included in some invoice, so some order going on, some purchase by some customers to be delivered, it's not the case to withdraw a product while a sales process is on the fly. So I want, in this case, to create some checks using Apex in order to avoid that I withdraw a product that is still in use, that is still included in some invoices. And since I may have many invoices with many item lines within each invoice, the logic that I need to implement is much more complex than what I can do with Process Builder or other means, or just a validation rule. So I need something more powerful. I need the power of Apex. So let me just put this merchandise product still in the active state, because I want to create the Apex code that lets me check that this product is in fact inserted into the line items of some invoice. So if I check this invoice, I see that the invoice is still open. So it is still a sales process that is active, and I cannot withdraw a product without checking that it is not going to impact on these sales processes. So as you've seen, I have had to travel and click through many objects, and I need some powerful logic to do the same. So travel and check all the connected objects under the connected database objects to be sure that I do not withdraw a product that is connected to some open invoice. How do I do that? I go to the Setup menu, and the Developer Console is my tool to develop Apex code. I have actually it already open here. In the Developer Console, which is one of the development environments that I can use with Salesforce, I could use Eclipse, I could use Visual Studio Code. In this case, just for the sake of brevity, I'm using an integrated development environment that is within Salesforce and doesn't require me to install any software locally. So I'm going to create a trigger here, and the trigger will get executed, will get called, the code that I'm going to write, every time I update a merchandise product. And what I'm going to write here is code. Oh, sorry. I just need to take this code. Here. This is the code of my trigger. The trigger will check for any product, any merchandise product, and it will select all the data from the database, and it will check for all the products that is going to be withdrawn, but also it will check that it doesn't have any line items that are included in an invoice that is open. So this code is a query, a SOQL query, that can be used to check the status of the merchandise and see if before withdrawing it, it is not connected to some invoice that is still open. And if this is the case, so if I have line items and their number is more than 0, so I have at least one line item, and so these are all the checks that I can introduce, that I can code into my my program. It will check for the status, and if the status is withdrawn, then it will add an error and show me an error on the user interface. I can save this trigger, as you see here. And now, when I get back to the user interface and I try to put that product that we have seen before and that was, not controlled and not checked, if I try now to put it into the withdrawn status, since it has line items and connected invoices that are still open, I will get an error. You see here, I have the same message that I coded within my Apex trigger, and Salesforce, every time a user or more users contemporarily try to do something that is not possible according to the logic that I have developed, will send this notification and will not change the status of this object. Does it make sense? Do you have any questions? Okay, so before going on, I also need to tell you that the code that we have written so far isn't ready to go to production, because as I told you, every time we write some code with Apex, we need to be sure that it works correctly. And this is also very important for Salesforce, because Salesforce runs tests on the code that you write in Apex even every time Salesforce gets updated 3 times per year. So we need to provide the tests that are necessary for checking that the code behaves correctly, and to allow Salesforce to understand and to be sure that your code still works correctly even if the Salesforce version is updated. So we can generate test code, we can generate also test data in order to check that the code is running correctly. The tests that we use in our development practices can use data, and this data will not be written into the production records. So it is absolutely something that doesn't impact our real data, real production data. And also using some best practices can help us write good tests that really check for the real good working of our programs, of our Apex code and our triggers. Let me just get back to the demo here, and I will show you, for example, this test. As you see, the code here has some annotations and some specific strings and declarations that specify that these are logic, these are code, these are piece of codes that just get run to test the correct working of the code that we wrote just 5 minutes ago. We can have the test to start and stop. These are calls, these are piece of code that is used to tell Salesforce not to implement the governor limits, because we are just testing. So some of the checks, some of the controls in this case are, let's say, relaxed in order for our tests to run smoothly and really check that every single condition is verified. How can we be sure that the test goes okay? We have to code accordingly, we have to write these tests, and then typically at the end we insert this instruction at cert equals that generates an error if something goes wrong. So at this point we can run the test, and in this case, what does this test do? It is going to generate some test data and invoke the trigger on the data that is generated. Just for giving you an example, this is the data that is used. So the test code is using these records here. It has inserted these records and has modified these records from the active to the withdrawn state in order to check that the code that we have written in the trigger is working correctly. And we can see the results of the tests here. You should be able to see that the status is okay. We can also, from the user interface, see that there have been no failures. All our tests are okay. So we can be sure that our code is running correctly. And this, again, are the tests that also Salesforce engineering is running to make sure the code still works correctly, even with the Salesforce updates. So this was actually a very short introduction to Apex and to Apex triggers, just to give you an idea of how the logic and the development of code can be used to implement complex interactions, complex checks within the data and the application that we can write in Salesforce. This is a very good starting point for creating the first Lightning component, and it also has an Apex class and an Apex controller within it. Very simple, a very good starting point for those of you like admins or maybe just curious customers who want to understand the basics of Apex, and you can really replicate what you have seen here in a much smaller, let's say, demo environment, the inner working of what we have seen so far. So if you have questions, I really urge you to use these two trailhead trails, Apex Basics and Database, and Apex Triggers. They can be very useful for those of you who want to start, getting into the details of coding and creating very, articulated and complex applications within Salesforce. Thank you.